It's all happening at the Politicrat Daily Podcast online store, and you can go there right now at the-politicrat.myshopify.com. Lots of good new items, brand new, designed by yours truly. So please head to the Politicrat Daily Podcast online store now. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Thursday, February the 18th, 2021. On this edition of the Politicrat, a conversation about Anita Hill, the professor, and gender and race. This conversation was held via Zoom last week, and I guest hosted this conversation for the Mechanics Institute Library here in San Francisco, California. You're going to get to hear that conversation, and you will not want to miss it. Welcome back. Before the conversation from last week, I wanted to report to you the book recommendation as I return to recommending some very important books that you must read. Today's book recommendation is Black Women in Antiquity. It is a book edited by Ivan Van Sertima. Last name V-A-N, second last name S as in Sam, E-R-T as in title, I-M-A. Ivan Van Sertima. Black Women in Antiquity. You may remember that earlier this month I recommended a book from him that was by him that is called They Came Before Columbus. The African Presence in Ancient America, I believe that's the subtitle. So once again, the recommendation, Black Women in Antiquity. It's a really important book about royalty and black women who led that royalty and also went into battle, led armies on the African continent and across it. Be sure to read that book. I will be returning to the Who Was That segment tomorrow, when I play a voice and you have to figure out who it is. That's returning tomorrow. But without any further ado, I do want to get to a conversation that I hosted and moderated on Friday of last week in a guest hosting capacity for the Mechanics Institute Library in San Francisco, California. I had previously hosted an event there via Zoom for the documentary I Am Not Your Negro, which is a fantastic documentary that you must see. It is available on Netflix right now. It's directed by Raoul Peck. It is about James Baldwin and his relationship with three very important people in American history, particularly in the 1960s. Please watch this documentary as soon as you possibly can. This conversation that I had moderated last week was a conversation about the Anita Hill documentary entitled Anita Speaking Truth to Power. It's a 2013 documentary directed by Freida Lee Mock. It is about the events of September and October of 1991, the infamous hearings into the Supreme Court nomination of Clarence Thomas and the even more infamous and shameful persecution of Professor Anita Hill. This conversation took place, as I said, last Friday, with an audience of a number of people via Zoom here in the San Francisco Bay Area. What follows is the conversation. Sit back, buckle up, and listen to this. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so very much for being here on this Friday evening. I hope you are all well. I hope you are feeling well. We are, of course, going through a lot, all of us in our different ways, and I want to thank you for spending the next hour or so here with the good people of Mechanics Institute, Matthew and Pam. Now, I want to just say a few things about the film for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so, and Matthew certainly put some things on the table that I wanted to actually speak about, but then also really get into the substance of the film. So for a couple of minutes, I want to talk about the overarching societal things that dovetail in, and then the bulk of the rest of the 10 minutes will be spent on the film itself by Freida Lee Mock. First of all, I do want to say, and this is really important, I always start out by saying that Black Lives Matter, and they must continue to matter, and they do. So that's something I always start with whenever I speak about film or anything in general. And now I want to get into particularly the atmosphere. And Matthew talked about the fact that it seemed like just a few years, 7 or 8 years ago for him. I remember watching this in 1991. I remember watching every minute of this in 1991. I remember where I was in New York City when I watched it in 1991, because I felt that I was seeing something that I had actually seen before. And it was a system that was putting a black woman on trial and forcing her to relive the horrors that she had articulated and had alleged. And quite frankly, for me as a black man, it's a flashback to a time before I was even alive, enslavement, and what enslavement did to black people, the enslavement of black people, the divisions it caused between black men and black women, the manifestations of that and how that came to be in the year 1991, and the divisions that it even caused in 1991 when you had Clarence Thomas over here and Anita Hill over here. And the overall view I'm going to give before getting into the substance of the film is that this was a showcase, as my my bit of merchandise falls behind me here. This was a showcase. This was a showcase, and you had a black woman put on trial. And you had white men whom, when you think about this politically now, Joe Biden is in charge of the committee, the Senate Judiciary. 3 or so years later, there would be allegations against him that will come up later, but there would be a situation with him that a woman named Tara Reid would allege that he raped her. That's one. If you remember watching that film, on either side of him, sitting on the other side of him, directly to his right, was Strom Thurmond, white segregationist, fathered a child out of wedlock with a black woman. To the left of Joe Biden was Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy, Mary Jo Kopechne, Chappaquiddick. What you had here, ladies and gentlemen, everybody, was a system that was put in place, in my view, to ensure the outcome that we got. Joe Biden didn't provide the opportunity for witnesses to come forward that would have helped Anita Hill's case greatly. And so that's just a portion of the social, political, historical landscape that I want to introduce to you that you might want to consider when we talk about this in further exploration. Now, the substance of the film itself for me. In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about what Freida Lee Mock has done. And I think this film plays partly as a horror movie. This film plays partly as an empowerment movie. This documentary plays partly as a chronicle for someone who just wants to get through life, but is lonely even though she has a lot of support. Lonely even though she has 13 or 12 other siblings. Lonely even though her students undeniably love her, because she is a pioneer in one of the early, there are many others before her, but really the American consciousness has really got to know in this TV age. She really was, as Matthew points out, a pioneer, and went through hell and paved that way for many white women who I think owe, a lot of women, but white women in particular, who I think owe her a great deal of debt. Not because, obviously it was the fault of the men that brought them to this place, but Anita Hill was the one that made it, I think, more comfortable or more palatable for some of those women or any other woman to come forward when they felt like it, if they ever wanted to. Christine Blasey Ford, Monica Lewinsky, I can go down the whole list. But what Freida Lee Mock does is very, very wise and smart. At the very beginning, she plays us a phone call, a voice message, provided by Ginny Thomas, a white woman who happens to be married to Clarence Thomas. And we know now about Ginny Thomas in other events of these political days. Alleged to have paid for some of the buses and funded some of the attacks, the terrorist attack of January 6th. At the very end of this documentary, a quote that is read out by a black woman of none other than Sojourner Truth. And for those of you who may not know who Sojourner Truth was, she was a suffrage movement individual, a black woman who fought for the right to vote, among other things, a pioneer and activist in her own right, and was actually left, quite frankly, she and other black women by the side of the road when it came to voting in 1920. And as you know, white women won the right to vote that year in the United States. And it wasn't until 1965, till black women really principally got that right themselves. And I thought there was no accident in the way that was bookmarked in the film. I also found very compelling what Freida Lee Mock did was paint this picture of the overwhelming support that Anita Hill had in the general public eye, and the letters, the artifacts, all of the people who testified but didn't testify. When I watched this film, the moment when she goes into her one of the areas of her house in Oklahoma, and you see these drawers and drawers and drawers of letters, and she talks about 20,000, 25,000 pieces of mail. And these to me are people testifying that weren't allowed to testify, that Joe Biden also didn't allow to testify. By extension, the women and the people who could have testified for Anita Hill. It was as if these 25,000 pieces of mail served as a refutation, a support mechanism for Anita Hill, albeit perhaps many years later. I thought that was very effective. I thought it was very touching. She was only 35 years old at the time when she was going through all of this. She was a law professor. She became a law professor and even more esteemed, and she was well respected. But I also think, in a way, that over these last 30 years or so, even though her name has popped in and out of the news, Joe Biden, the apology or non-apology, there's still something in me that feels that she has not been properly respected, despite the fact that she's written a memoir about the story, what happened, Speaking Truth to Power. You had Jill Abramson, and you had the wonderful investigative reporter Jane Mayer write a book themselves called Strange Justice. I recommend you read that and Anita Hill's book, Speaking Truth to Power. I think the thing that I take away from this film most of all is that she went through so much hell. She was put on trial. And what Clarence Thomas did, which I cannot escape here, in my view is unforgivable. It's not so much that he's playing any cards, because I like the gentleman, the Wall Street lawyer who spoke, who said there's no such thing as a race card. He hates that term. I hate that term too. But I can tell you what Clarence Thomas did was cowardly. That's what he did. It wasn't that he played a race card, because that is an insult to even say that. It's that he was a coward, and he used a system to trample gender, to trample sexual assault, to trample the kinds of things that the patriarchy does every day to women, whether they are black women, white women, Asian women, Latinas, Native women. And that is the avenue that Clarence Thomas went down. So those are some of my points. I could talk a whole lot longer about them. But as we get to the 15 or 20 minute mark here now, I would really like to hear, and I'm sure everyone would like to hear from all of you about what you thought about what you saw. And also, one question I'd like to leave you with, and I don't know if any of you will answer it, because it's a question that might catch you off guard. Why do you care about Anita Hill? I want you to consider that question. And it's not an entirely strange question. And it's not entirely really a quote-unquote stupid one. But I really would like to get an answer to that as well, if you so please. But now, thank you for listening and hearing me. The floor is all yours.
Omar, thank you very, very much. That was a brilliant introduction, and much to contemplate. And we will start our back and forths here. The first blue hand is Trisha. Good evening, Trisha.
Good evening. Why do I love cinema lit? I love cinema lit for many reasons. But one of the reasons is that I would never have watched this documentary on Kanopy were it not for cinema lit. Why? Because I lived through it. Not only did I live through it, I was working at ABC News in New York City at the time, where we had televisions all around where I sat doing my work where there were televisions everywhere. And I literally watched every second of this event. I was about 5 years older than Anita Hill at the time. And it's so interesting to compare what I felt then and what I felt now. First of all, I was just, it was sort of a shock. As far as I remember, if somebody might correct me, but I do believe that the phrase sexual harassment came about in articles at that time written about Anita Hill. No, Linda's shaking her head. So maybe it occurred before. And of course, she was on the EEOC. But it seemed like that whole issue came to the fore in people's consciousness at that time. But what I felt about the film, first of all, it was so wonderful to end with that hopeful and those beautiful girls and children watching these things now. And we realize, I'm older now, and I realized the passing the baton to the next generation. And I was so grateful the filmmaker included those young women who were so fantastic. And Anita Hill says, I feel I can let go and let these women, speak. But I have to say my dominant feeling watching this documentary was, first of all, I don't think I would have ever had the graciousness, the grace, the calmness of this woman, Anita Hill. How calm and slow and directed. And she listened to every question from Alan Simpson and the Southern the gentleman who was talking about, are you a martyr? She was present, what we call now mindfulness. She was present for every question. She didn't react, as I might have, with more ire. She reacted with graciousness. And I was just, and given what we've been through this week, I don't know how many of you watched what's going on this week. I have. When she said this phrase, she said phrases that would have been a cliche to me 10 years ago, but now have so much meaning. She said, courage and dignity will outlast the bully. And I just, I think she is fantastic. I loved her then, I love her now, and I thank God she was a law professor with that wonderful mother and that family she came from. Look at that house she came from out in the field and what she became. So I think she really did pave the way. And Omar asked, what did she mean to me? And that is the answer, is that she provides a model of graciousness and courage and dignity in the face of incredible ignorance.
Well, I appreciate what you had to say. It's a very touching response and feeling that you have. And it's interesting because, my question was, why do you care? But if you say, what you feel about her, that's perfectly fine too. The reason I asked the question in the way I asked it was not because I wanted to provoke a, well, of course I care response. It was really genuflected with why this particular person so much, because this has been going on for such a long time in our history. And this isn't directed at the last person who gave her response. It's more quickly general before the next person gets to ask a question. I promise I'll be very brief. It's really about the same feeling that I would have asked about a George Floyd. What was it about that particular thing, that particular execution, that got many other people in white America to wake up? Versus, and I asked that about Anita Hill. So that's why I asked, why do you care? But again, feel free to subvert that, what might seem like an outrageous question to you, and tailor it the way you do wish if you're not comfortable answering it. But I do thank you very much for your comment and your response. It means a lot to me, and I really encourage everybody to continue to be open and honest about how they feel about the film or anything I've said. So the next person, please, to speak, please.
That would be Ying Ying.
Okay, hi everyone. Okay, so the thing is, Omar, I really agree with you watching the Senate Judiciary hearing from 30 years ago. First of all, what happened during that hearing, the way it was structured, I mean, it really explains a lot of things about what went on this week in the Senate, if you want my personal opinion. And also, apparently some of the same people are still there 30 years later. Okay, so that's one of the problems with that particular body. But anyway, so the thing is, yes, I have to say, I did watch this hearing 30 years ago, but I don't remember much about it, except about, all I can remember now is her testifying about, working for Clarence Thomas. And the thing that really stuck out in my mind was the pubic hair on the Coke can. That was really, so the thing is to watch this woman who was so intelligent and articulate, being harassed basically by these senators, these clueless senators, was really very, it was very informative, I have to say. It really explains a lot of things. So I really, yeah, the thing is that she brought this all, she brought it to the forefront by being in this Senate hearing. And the thing is, plus it was the Republicans who really did not want to screw up Clarence Thomas's chances of being confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. So, of course they were going to, harass her basically with their questions. But the thing, because they really wanted to confirm him, and Clarence Thomas helped them, with kind of going off on a side issue, where, well, he did make himself into sort of a martyr, frankly, to me, it seemed like. Anyway, so the thing is, why I should even care about this, because I've seen a few of Freida Lee Mock's documentaries. I mean, she's very skilled. What I liked about towards the end, I mean, first of all, she was threatened with like losing her job, even though she was a tenured professor. I mean, why should she be threatened with losing her job? I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, the thing is that what I really liked as the film progressed, yes, was seeing all the support that she got from all those people and the students and the general public and everything like that. And also, it sort of reminded me, especially towards the end, about the, passing this baton of speaking out to a younger generation. It was just reminding me a lot of that documentary about Michelle Obama becoming, because she also inspired young women, to like seek higher education and, to enhance their chances, and so forth. And so I found that very inspiring at the end, I mean, so, yeah, I mean, it was amazing. She was extremely articulate and she was very focused, I mean, while they were grilling her, she was extremely focused and very measured in her responses. And that was really impressive, but of course she was a law professor. So, I mean, it was more, to me, it was, pretty much expected that she would be, I mean, I don't know, maybe these people, they were just trying to trip her up. That's what I felt, and anyway, so I think this movie was very inspiring, I mean, it's something that I hadn't investigated it very closely, so I'm glad I saw it. And yeah, so she was a pioneer, and it's difficult to be a pioneer. Anyway, that's all I have.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Ying, for this. I cannot tell you how much your comments highlight a lot of how I feel about the film. And one other thing is, it was a reenactment. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it was a reenactment of the kinds of things that she was alleging. It just took me back to, years before I was born, and what white men did to black women in the way of rape in enslavement days, except you had a systemic reenactment of that rape with, if I may say, an all-white male Judiciary Committee. Now, they weren't obviously physically raping her, but
they were torturing her in a way.
Thank you. You took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was about to say. But they were torturing her. They were traumatizing her. And they were getting her to reenact this whole thing.
Exactly.
They never, and I listened to this when I watched it till on the East Coast when I was living there in New York, till 1 a.m. Eastern time. I don't ever remember any of those senators saying the word penis or anything. They would say private part. They would always ask Anita Hill to say, what did she say? What did he say to you? And it was a reenactment.
They were enjoying it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I agree. I bookend your comments respectfully and thank you for your contribution. I really do value what you and everyone has to say, and I do agree with you 100%. So thank you. And the next person, please, to speak.
Michelle and Judy. Hello, good evening.
Hi, I'm just here to be a gadfly. Yeah, well, I love the beginning because that was such and I don't want to offend anyone, but a pure, what I would call Karen moment. It was just so incensed. I mean, the phone call, the phone message. I just said, I cannot believe that you actually did this. But that is not the main point. I was in the Chronicle newsroom when this whole thing played out. And I remember, this is, of course, before the internet, blah, blah, blah. We were just stunned that words like pubic hair and Coke can and all this stuff were actually being, broadcast. It's just like, what? I just remember everyone being stunned. And what I think that should be there, I just remember my mother, my late mother, saying, and she's an old school, she said, well, had she been white, then this wouldn't have gotten to this point, and Clarence would have been like bounced and then she said, "Oh my God, they're all Yale law grads. I have never seen such a parade of intelligent, educated Black people on TV." And I said, yes, mother. But that was, that just shows that 30 years back, these sort of images of, and I hate to say articulate, but I will, but if you've gone to Yale Law, if you've had these fancy jobs, you will present yourself as being, very polished in this. And may I say that as a Black woman, she does not have the luxury of what I would call Black tears, because no one gives a rat's ass about Black tears. She had to behave as she did. She did not have the option of being an aggrieved, put upon woman, because she's not white. And then back then, what I think was a subtext of how sexism intersects with patriarchy, because I heard among a lot of people that here we go again, another Black woman undermining the Black man, and I just felt like, it just has so many roots in slavery and Jim Crow and the Black woman and how, we just don't count. And so I think that, I don't think that she had the same tools that Christine Blasey Ford had, who kind of was on the verge of tears and this and that, and everyone felt sorry for her because, she just did not have the option of presenting herself as an aggrieved, vulnerable person. That is, once again, just more of a testimony to the system that we're in. And I thought that the film it just kind of took me back 30 years, but, it's just that you just don't have the option not to appear to be strong and dignified and whatever if you're a Black woman in the U.S. That's just how things are. And I think that it probably causes a lot of unseen damage. It was just, it just brought up a lot of complicated, sexism, patriarchy, racism, etc. It was just so mixed up, and it still is. It still is. And, I just wish that non-white women had the same option, to have the same range of behavior that white women have, but that just isn't true, even now. And I don't think it will ever be, an option. So that's my 2 cents. Hope I didn't rave. But it was a very interesting film.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I'm right on with what you've said. Let me just say that for a few quick seconds.
Angry Black woman.
Let me say this also to you and to everybody else who's listening and watching, that this was not just a 30 years ago trial. This was a 400 years plus trial. That's what we saw in 1991. This is 400 years on trial, and it was the Black woman being put on trial and the Black man being used as well to put the Black woman on trial. And there was no accident that phone call. This is why I say that was a real masterstroke by the director. There was no accident that she started that whole documentary with that phone call. And I would go into it, but out of respect for the fact that all of you are here to also, and I respect this obviously as well, to speak about how you feel about the film, I will move to the next person to speak, please. Thank you. And thank you, Michelle.
All right. Steve, you're up next. Good evening.
Okay. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more of what you say, Omar, about the phone call, because I have questions about it. I have to ask, I've asked myself, and I wonder if any of you ask yourself, is this not about race as much as we are thinking it is? Would anything be different if the same words were used and it was a white man and a white woman. It's a woman being victimized. She's not being victimized as a black woman. She's being victimized as a woman. I don't see it as racial in this case.
Right.
All right. I was just waiting for you if you were going to add anything to that.
No, I'm not going to add anything. In the same way that the OJ trial, it never came out as a racist thing. It seemed both those families liked each other. They never used nasty words about each other. That wasn't racial either. It was the circumstances. Just because Clarence and Anita are both Afro-American, I don't see why it's a racial issue, as you say.
I hear your comment. I respect your view. What I speak to is we are never in a vacuum here. And I know you know that. I'm not questioning that you know that. And this comment's addressed to everybody, including yourself. But as you know well, we are not in a vacuum here. If we didn't have a history of enslavement, we didn't have a history of entrenched racism and, historic and present institutionalized racism, and if we didn't have a system that does not value, or that did not and still does not value, black people's lives, hence Black Lives Matter, then I might have a bit more sympathy with the view that you've shared. But we do have these things that have happened. And 400 plus years, and the Native Americans 500 plus years, those effects don't go away because they happened or really were very brutal back in the 15 and 1600s. This lingers. You have a whole group of people who have been traumatized and still are. And there is systemic violence. And I'll just be 30 seconds more on this. There is a whole systemic violence that happens. There is a systemic discrimination. And the mere fact that you would have Joe Biden sitting in the middle, and to the right of him, a Southern segregationist white man who fathered a black child out of wedlock, denied it for dozens of years. And then it came out finally after he died, or just about the time he died, or years after he died, that he had fathered that black child out of wedlock. And the mere fact that every one of those senators was a white male. And the fact that you had a black woman and you had a black man, and there were discussions of all the racist stereotypes and the racist and sexist stereotypes and the misogynoiristic stereotypes of black women. That phone call that you asked me to talk about, let me just do that for a quick few seconds and then let everybody else jump in with what they think. That phone call was a very, very clear, in my mind, very clear reiteration of the way that white society has looked at black women, whether it was in the 1600s or now, in terms of, well, what did you think you were doing, black woman? That was the tone of Ginny Thomas. 20 years later, I might add, in 2010. 20 years, almost 20 years later. Well, you might want to explain yourself. What do you think you were doing? This, and Michelle spoke to this a little bit, this inquiry into black women and how black women are supposed to feel about something. That kind of finger wagging that I felt when I watched that phone call. That's why I say Freida Lee Mock, she doesn't do things by accident. She knows exactly, like any other great filmmaker, she knows exactly what she's doing. And that finger wagging, the invisible finger wagging that I felt as a black man watching that you may not have felt yourself, but I did as a black man, because it's this hectoring of what a black woman should do or what she didn't do. There was an accusation and a presumption that surely you did something here. I mean, this does happen to other women, but it was very clear, the playing of that audio with a white woman telling a black woman, wag, 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 I'm wagging my finger at you, have a nice day. Awfully arrogant, awfully condescending, and patronizing, and a lot worse than that. But I do hear your point. I respect your opinion, and I appreciate you being honest enough to air your opinion. I welcome that from everybody, because that's what we should be. We're adults. So thank you for airing your view, and it's been heard by me and by everyone else. And forgive me for the extended response, but I do want to move on now, please, to the next speaker. Thank you.
All right. Linda Chapman. Linda.
Okay. I'm being heard, right? Okay.
Yep.
Well, my point of view is totally different. I was a professional in this field when when this hearing occurred. And I have to say, I didn't see the film today, not for want of trying. We have the miracles of mechanics technology interfering. I hope to see it later. But I watched all those hearings because that was my field of work to begin with, And Clarence Thomas was the villain. He was a despicable piece of trash who did this, to that woman, and then played the race card. And of course, here are all these senators who were white, of course, because, they were. But men in general, white, black, whatever, Asian, this is what they did. Women were originally supposed to take it. Like when I was a young girl, I went to work in the War on Poverty. And so the people who were, that I was working with were black. And I mean, some of them were toads. It wasn't that they necessarily had power over you, but you'd be really uncomfortable, got to get away from here. And then the person who really, 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 really pulled the number of exploiting was the head of the agency where I was working. And he was a nice man and all that. But, it wasn't like this was a field for white men and black women were oppressed. This is a matter of sexism, and what women were supposed to take. All right, by the late 70s, mid to late 70s, that is when it came to the forefront, well before this. That's when it first began to be looked at as, is this a civil rights issue, sexual harassment in the workplace? And at that time, I was working for Social Security. The head of the agency was, where I was, the head of the agency was Japanese American, and he had his little white secretary, not white, his little Chinese secretary, and he probably wouldn't have done it to a black woman. He wouldn't have been able to get away with it. On a Saturday, he came and had her in there alone. He ripped open her blouse and, et cetera. And he was making phone calls to her house that her husband was recording. And this was, sometime in the 70s when we were just beginning to wonder, is this something that could be dealt with under the civil rights law, or is this just normal? Because this is what women had to do with. You had to figure out how to handle it like she did, right? And it came to pass that the women in the office where I was working, the managers were going to march down to the Social Security regional office about this. So at that point, what did they do? Well, they removed her. That was typical. They would remove her from the office as opposed to him. And then finally, they found another place for him and so on. But nobody quite knew what to do with it. And at that point, in late 70s, I went over into civil rights and equal opportunity. And EEOC was beginning to put out guidelines, Eleanor Holmes Norton and so on, just as they had previously done with, employment, discrimination related to national origins and stuff like that. And, you read these things like a Bible trying to figure out because, how do you handle these things? So by the time that she had this hearing, I was, I'd been teaching about sexual harassment. I'd worked for the Army. It was a big issue about teaching it. But, people still were pretty dense. Let's say a lot of them, like Joe Biden and all those other people, they just were completely uneducated. They did not have the kind of training that we were giving, let's say, in the Army. And they allowed him, therefore, to manipulate. And he played the race card. And they didn't want to, he made them think that you shouldn't be attacking this black man about it. And they themselves were totally uneducated on the subject of sexual harassment. And what was interesting to me and other people in the field was that everything that they accused her of was exactly what we were teaching everybody you should expect. Women are not going to quit their job because of this. That job is important to them. She had one of the best jobs she could get probably for a young woman at that time and in civil rights. Why didn't you file a complaint? Well, who was the head of the agency where she would have had to file the complaint? Who was in charge of all discrimination complaints, right? And before he was nominated, he was head of the EEOC for a while, and he came out, to a conference in San Francisco, and I remember him. People didn't like the idea that he was there, and he says, well, I think you have me confused with another Clarence, because Clarence Pendleton, who is even worse, had been appointed to head the Civil Rights Commission, et cetera. I mean, and I and other people whom I talked to at the time felt, I used to go to Washington, D.C. like a nun to the Vatican. I didn't want to work there, but that was, the center of our world in a way. And I will never be able to go to the Supreme Court now, I felt. I always wanted to go there, wrong time of year, whatever. I'll never be able to go because he'll be sitting there. So I've had my little say.
I appreciate your comment. I respect your view. Thank you for sharing your view and being honest. Of course, the goal is not for us to agree. The goal is for us to air our views. And I think you've done that very well, and I respect your right to do that. And thank you for being honest as well. And I do really appreciate that you were. And definitely, there's one thing I can say is we are still so backwards in this country, and there are others, but we are so backwards when it comes to the idea of how you treat a human being that is a woman. I mean, my gosh, hello, folks. This is where you and I can kind of have an accord. We are so backward in 2021. And in the 1970s, in this very state, there were men by law who could rape the women they were married to. Still into the 1970s, until that finally ended later in that decade. So that tells you something right there. We still have a long way to go. I can certainly concur with you on that. And thank you for your comment. Next person to speak, please.
All right. I think we've heard from Steve. I'm going to go to Barbara. Because we're getting towards 7:00 already.
Yes, so, we are.
Barbara, you're on. Hello.
Thank you. I'm going to try and make this brief then. To your question, Anita Hill, for me, was an important landmark in women's rights because she represents like the first woman to be publicly pilloried for bringing out accusations of sexual harassment, and to see what happened in the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings was kind of like deja vu. To see that a woman's accusations in the face of some guy's indignation at being accused can be totally dismissed was just kind of like to me, it felt like we haven't gotten anywhere. And that really, it wasn't brought out in the movie, but it just, to me, it was when the Kavanaugh hearings happened and you could see that it was a white woman accusing a white man and the same result happens. You just feel like women's rights haven't gone anywhere. So on that, I also took away from the movie an interesting observation where they were talking about her parents' family and how they had moved from the Deep South to Oklahoma because there was less discrimination. I thought that was a very interesting point, and it's just an interesting takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I'm glad you brought that up. I know we're hitting up against time, so I'm going to speak a lot less, certainly. But thank you for your comment, and I really appreciate that. Next comment, please. Thank you very much. Next person, please.
That would be Jolene.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Omar, for introducing this film. I think it's a very important one in our history. and I was going through my own experience working for a large consulting firm in on the peninsula while this was happening, and while Anita Hill, it was this was a real touchstone moment for me while I was going through my own very painful experience. And for 30 years, I couldn't speak about it, and it caused me to stutter for a long time because I couldn't give voice to what I was experiencing. And at the same time, though, I'm glad that Freida Lee Mock in 2013 helped to document, this very important piece of history. And I also want to raise the understanding and give you an awareness that there's a filmmaker, her name is Nina Menkes, who is in the process of producing and directing her own film on sex and power and visual cinema representation in Hollywood with the type of films that had been produced and directed by such filmmakers as Orson Welles, Spike Lee, and Martin Scorsese and the like. And it's called Sex and Power. And I think it's something for us to watch out for. And I have to commend Anita Hill for raising these issues associated with gender equality and also gendered representation. And I think that it was very apparent to me among the white men that were part of that Senate Judiciary Committee that they, I think they were very leery about raising questions because it might expose their own past that they were trying to hide.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. I appreciate what you had to say. In the interest of time...
Thank you.
You're welcome. In the interest of time, the next speaker, please.
That would be Paul. Paul?
Hello, I'm Paul.
Hello, Paul.
Hello, Paul.
I have a couple of comments. I watched the movie recently and was quite euphoric at the end of it. So it wasn't until the next day that I gave it some critical assessment. I thought that because, I have to say that I did think the movie was quite wonderful. However, I am critical of the movie because I thought that the first half was very compelling, but I thought the second half was hagiographic. And I thought that all it was telling us how wonderful Anita Hill was, which is I agree. But I thought that there were much more serious issues that the movie could have addressed. One of those issues, which I was interested in, was that I'm a big Biden person, but that they seem to whitewash Biden in the fact that it's my understanding that it was Biden who refused to allow other witnesses, other women. And I was a lawyer, and having a couple of other women on that stand would have been, I think, very, very persuasive. The other thing I was interested in was our speaker, Omar, who said that he doesn't use. This is just to you, Omar. You said that you don't use the race card, and that's fine. That's fine with me. But I was interested in: are you saying that instead of using the race card, Clarence Thomas, simply was talking about white supremacy? Because it seemed, and I don't have. One can use any term one wants, but I think certainly he used the issue of white supremacy, or as someone else talked about here, and used the term race card. So I'm interested in why you find that term offensive, or a term you don't like.
I really would love to talk about that, except, and I'll be very brief on this, absolutely used the instrumentalities of whiteness and white supremacy. That is, and whiteness and the system of that. That is how it has to be framed. And it's not semantical. This is a very important point. we are not cards. We are not cards. And a system would say that, right? A system of white dominance would say that this is a card. Human beings are not cards. Black people as human beings certainly are not cards to be played. So that's the quickest way to answer that. I really do, Paul, respect your comment. And as an attorney myself, I watched this during that era and I thought, wow, this is going to go in all kinds of directions. Paul, thank you so much for your comment. I really appreciate it. I know we're running up against the clock. The next person, if there is a next person to speak, please.
And we don't need to end promptly at 7, so it would be fine to keep going if folks are so inclined. That would be great. Susan? And
Hi, thank you. I'll be brief because I'd rather hear Omar's comments, but I was asking myself, why did I care? So I thought that was a compelling question. I appreciate a provocative question. And I was a young woman at the time, but I know that we were riveted because of Anita Hill's courage to speak up, as has been mentioned already, as that was so unusual. And I think we felt, because of her enormous credibility, that there was hope for finally some justice after the hundreds of years of mistreatment of women, that she would actually get justice. And I think we still care now because she didn't. And I think it's interesting to think about the movie. At the time, I felt like everyone believed her, and the movie certainly underlined that she had enormous public support. People believed her. So what? It's just interesting to me to think about who didn't believe her, or did everyone believe her, and then what were they acting from? It's just a curious question, because I thought it was really emphasized that she was widely believed. And so what went wrong? Thank you.
And thank you very much for the comment. I really do appreciate it. Very much so, I do. And thank you for providing it. Next comment, please. Next person to speak, please.
Steve, and then we'll finish with Michelle.
Okay. I just want to tell all of you to not rush out, and go to YouTube and watch a film made this year called The Assistant. Have any of you heard of it?
I have, yes.
Have you seen it?
I have it here, but I have not seen it yet, Steve.
You must.
Okay.
It's about this, not a big dramatic courtroom trial, just the many little indignities that a woman is forced to go through in the workplace by a stellar actress. I forget her name. The most understated, wonderful performance. And this isn't, rape or ripping off clothes, just the small things. The Milieu is a New York production company, sort of like Harvey Weinstein's, but not to be parallel to Harvey Weinstein. It's called The Assistant. You all must see it.
Thank you, Steve, for that. Really appreciate that you did contribute that, and I will now with haste. And I hope everybody does the same. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Next person to speak, please.
Michelle.
Hey, Michelle is Judy, or Judy is Michelle.
Oh, wait. Here's Judy.
Hi. I'm just thinking that I think the term race card is a term that it doesn't say, I think it's an easy way out. If you have something against, or you're denying something against blacks or Jews or Catholics or guinea pigs, then you say that. You don't use a race card in general terms. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it makes black people just see purple.
Well, Michelle was saying, blacks object to it. I'm just saying a race card is an easy way out rather than defining who you're against or what you're against.
Or what the issue is.
Yeah. It's just, you define issue versus.
It's a bit vague.
It's just not, it doesn't address what I think.
It's vague.
Yeah, it's vague.
And and thank you for that, Judy, and also Michelle for your contribution. And I'll address that really quickly, and is that what it does, apart from being grossly offensive and insulting to me as a black person, is it deflects away from the system. It deflects away from the aspects of institutional racism and institutional whiteness and white dominance. And that is, as I said earlier, in a language and a prism and a perimeter of where we are in a society. That is what a system will do. It will invent language like this so that we're all speaking in this language, in this strange language, as James Baldwin would say in I Am Not Your Negro, which, of course, I talked about the last time I was here with you all. That is what that is all about. There's this way that we speak about things, including about sex and gender too, but in this case about race and about institutionalized whiteness. If we started to talk about that and mention that rather than mentioning, race cards, and we started to talk about, this institutional whiteness, you get a different level of attention and thought in the brain. Because to say race card is phenomenally lazy and dishonest, in my view. It's phenomenally lazy and dishonest and offensive. And you really do have to look at the system and the structure in the first place and the language that it brings us to speak in and think in. So I want to thank you, Judy and Michelle. I don't know if there's anyone else that would like to speak.
I want
Okay, then you are welcome to, unless, Matthew, you have something you wanted to say.
We're here on folks' good graces and stamina, and we can certainly keep going. I don't want to impose on Omar beyond, whatever. And actually, I would love to say a few things too. So I think we could keep going if folks so decided. But obviously, you can all shut the door at any time. But this is very lively. So let's. If you want to keep going, we can keep going.
All right.
Paul.
Sounds good.
Paul, you're up.
Yes, Paul.
Please continue to use the blue hands. That's very helpful, by the way, folks, if you want to say things.
You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. So, Omar, what Clarence Thomas did, I think in his very first paragraph, or maybe his very first line, is use the phrase high-tech lynching. Let's forget that he used the race card. Let's forget that. Then how would you personally, what words would you describe as to what he did in using those words?
No, he again, I said it earlier, Paul, and I appreciate you asking the question. I said it earlier. He rendered a use of systemic whiteness and dominance. That is the instrument that he alluded to and used, and he evoked it. That's what systemic whiteness and dominance is, and it results in someone being hung, a black person, a black man, a black woman. And he utilized that as his descriptor. And all I'm saying is, and I respect your view and your question, Paul, all I am saying here is that I really do believe it is much more helpful for us to open the frame up and look at the system that produces the language in which we speak about things like this. And also, it is very important to look at the historical frames, because if we don't look at those kinds of things, the conversations that we have and the language that we use can be somewhat incomplete. And that's with due deference and respect to your comment. I'm not assailing this as against you specifically. I am simply saying that I do believe that when we have conversations on these levels, we really do, I think, have to look at what the language is, who's using it, and if the person using it has a level of power or not. And in saying that, if I may just finish here for a few brief seconds, and in saying that, I think it's also, illustrative for us all to think about the power of a question. Who gets the right to ask a question? And I now refer this back to the film and back to 1991. who gets the power to utilize a question and to ask it. And the person asking the question has a certain level of power in any situation. But in this arena, in the 1991 arena, in the 1619 arena, in the 1861 arena, that person is got a lot of power, a white male senator. And again, we are asking and answering these questions, and we're all giving these viewpoints that we have. And we are doing this in the context of a system. And so to answer your question, he is evoking something that is produced out of a system that is brutal and violent to black people. And this is, again, we may agree or disagree on this. This is not about semantics, and certainly not to me as a black person. This is about something that goes deep and serious. And it's really a discussion that you and I, Paul, could have for many weeks. And that's a serious one. I mean that without dismissing. I mean that very earnestly. So I do appreciate your points, your question, and the question of me. I think it's important that we do challenge each other, raise the questions, raise the issues. And I do thank you for doing that, Paul, earnestly and sincerely. And thank you very much for your comment and your question. And I do value it, and I respect you. And I respect everybody here who's contributed. And if there's anyone else who would like to ask a question or a comment or address anything about the film, I really would appreciate them doing so. So next person, please.
Oh, I need a drink.
I wanted to just briefly say, we'll hear from Jolene, but I wanted to get back to your original question, which I think has been given some attention here, but it is an intriguing question and a somewhat unexpected one. And yet it's so basic. Why do we care about Anita Hill? And I've been pondering that this whole time, and I'm realizing that I think, at least my short answer is that I care about Anita Hill because I believe her. And if I believe her, then I want justice for her. And if I want justice for her, I want justice for all women who have been in a similar situation. And that makes it huge. That makes her huge. The meaning of her life and the meaning of her work and what she's come to symbolize, absolutely huge.
Thank you, Matthew. And I appreciate the way you answered that, too. I mean, I know a few others have tackled the question in some ways, but the framing of your answer and the way that you put those blocks together in very concise terms, I do appreciate and respect. So thank you, Matthew, for what you've had to say. Is there anyone else that'd like to speak? I believe you mentioned Jolene is next.
Jolene has got a hand up. Yes.
I just want to say something about the structure of the meeting itself. In that, okay, there's Anita on one side, and then there's all the other senators, and there are to be about 20, and they almost outnumber her, and her supporters and such were behind her, and I have to draw similarities to my own meeting and hearing that I had, where all the management were on one side, and I wasn't given the opportunity to speak my piece, but they were just bombarding me with questions, and at the same time, the solution in my case was they said, we can continue your employment here if you like. You can set up an office, but then it would be right down the hall from my manager, who was my oppressor, and I didn't want to stay in that environment. And I thought, oh gosh, it left me, for me, I can just imagine myself in Anita's situation, because it left me extremely demoralized for years. And in some ways, my career was derailed for very many years until I had a chance to rethink the whole situation and everything, so I can understand the whole syndrome of victimization and the path toward empowerment. So that's in brief.
Jolene, I must say this to you. First of all, thank you again. And I also want to say, and I didn't say this before, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. I am very sorry for what happened to you. I really am.
Thank you, Omar. I understand. It's been a long path, but I can certainly empathize with those that might have experienced something like this. And so I think it took me a long time to find my voice, and you know, a lot of this has also cultural implications too as well, and also the strength to, you know, get help and such, and to also seek help from my family and my community and such. And I think I'm further, you know, with seeing this film and such, you know, with the kind of dignity and grace and courage that Anita has demonstrated, and Freida Lee Mock. You know, I'm for the past year during this whole pandemic, as I shared with Tricia, you know, I'm finding my voice toward developing a documentary film. And so I'm working on my first script.
Well, congratulations, Jolene. I'm moved by you. I'm moved by your courage and your voice. And thank you for your voice and for being here and for contributing and for your strength as well. Thank you so very much. It means a lot that you said what you said, and you're inspiring people too, and you've moved me here, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So thank you, Jolene.
Thank you, Omar.
You're welcome.
Before we wrap up and open up for our goodbyes, we with us is Laura Shepard, the events director, who would like to address the crowd. Good evening, Laura.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning, but my internet has been going in and out. So hello, Omar. And
hello, Laura.
Thank you so much for leading us in this very provocative and raw conversation about race, gender, justice, all these issues that we've been facing for so many decades now, and as you're pointing out, centuries, millennial. So, you know, I want to thank you for coming back and joining us, and we hope to have you back very soon again for more conversations.
It's all happening at the Politicrat Daily Podcast online store, and you can go there right now at the-politicrat.myshopify.com. Lots of good new items, brand new, designed by yours truly. So please head to the Politicrat Daily Podcast online store now. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to the conversation. One that certainly will have, I think, you thinking some more. One of the takeaways I have from the conversation is that we must unlearn this crazy, toxic, systemic language that we all use, unthinkingly in many cases indeed. It is ingrained in us. That is not an excuse, and it is not a justification, even for some of what you heard over this last hour or so during the conversation you just listened to. It is, however, a reality, and it is up to those who use this language that is systemic and from the point of view of the oppressing forces and oppressing institutions and people to unlearn that language that they swim in. Language is tied to systems. It is not language that is in a vacuum. And language is framed and made by those who are in control or in power. And the power of language is extremely important and powerful. And that's one of the reasons language is very important, and that I find it to be tremendously important. The power of a question. Who gets to ask the question? Who gets to answer it? How the question is asked, how it is framed, and how it is answered. We must take off the rose-colored glasses and the truncated or concaved lenses and start to look at the whole picture, a global perspective, and a look at the system that governs and utilizes the language, a look at the system that creates the language that we think in, that creates the language that we speak in, and creates the toxic terms like race card. A term that is designed to get you to not look at the system that created the conditions in the first place, where a so-called card is supposedly used. There is no such thing as a race card. And as I said in the conversation, black people are not cards. Racism is not a card to be played or dealt. Racism is something created by a system of whiteness and white dominance, an anti-black racism and anti-black oppression. That is the system. It is not a card. And Clarence Thomas did not play any card. Clarence Thomas invoked, in his own clumsy way, a system of whiteness. And he invoked a system of whiteness and anti-black oppression and anti-black violence in order to divert from the issue of misogyny and gender violence against women. In this particular case, a black woman. That is what happened during those hearings in 1991. I may not have come across clearly in explaining that during the back and forth that you heard. But as you can attest to in your own life, when you are in the heat of a moment in a conversation or in a presentation or in a Q&A, you do not always think of everything that you can say in the time that you have to say it. Nonetheless, I think now you have a clear idea of the perspectives that were brought, including my own. Thank you very much for listening. The work must continue, and having heard the dialogue that you heard, you must act. Please pass this conversation along to everybody, not just to people who already are aware, but to those who you know must hear this. Thank you very much indeed to those who hosted me, had me at this conversation to host it and moderate it. Thank you to all of those who participated. And thank you to you, once again, for listening. And to listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.